It's strange to realize that when I lived to the age of 72, I was invisible to my own children. Not literally invisible, though. They can see me just fine when they come to pay their respects once a month, but I've long since ceased to be a person to them. Now I'm just an annoying chore, a line on the to-do list between dentist appointments and utility bills. My name is Ezra Nightingale, widower, retired, former civil engineer, and a disappointment to my offspring. My wife Doris left this world 5 years ago, leaving me alone with an empty house in the Chesapeake and 3 children who seemed to be just waiting for a time when they could discuss my old age without their mother's restraining influence. Friday morning began as usual. I woke up at 6 a.m. sharp, a habit developed over 40 years of working on construction sites, and I never let go even in retirement. I brewed myself a strong cup of coffee, ate some peanut butter toast, and went out to get the mail. The mailbox was stuffed to the brim with sales brochures, bills, and an envelope from Chesapeake Financial Bank, where I keep my primary savings. Nothing out of the ordinary except that reports come at the beginning of the month, and this was only the middle of the month. I printed the envelope already in the house, settling into my favorite chair. Dear Mr. Nightingale, thank you for using our line of credit. I reread the first line twice. Line of credit? I didn't have any credit, never believed in debt, always lived within my means. I was going to buy a new car this year to replace my old Ford, but I planned to pay it off with cash accumulated over the years of my working life. The letter announced the activation of a line of credit for over $500,000. $500,000, an amount comparable to the cost of a decent house in our neighborhood. My hands shook, not from old age, but from anger and fear. Someone had made a terrible mistake, or worse, someone had used my name. I immediately called the bank. After a few minutes of rattling music and assurances that my call was very important, I heard the operator's voice. Mr. Nightingale. The girl spoke after I explained the situation. According to our records, you personally visited our office 2 weeks ago and signed all the necessary documents. That's impossible, I objected. 2 weeks ago, I was fishing with a friend in Norfolk. I have witnesses. Sir, we have your signature and a copy of your ID card. Someone forged them. My voice shook with indignation. I demand to see the manager. The girl reluctantly agreed, and we made an appointment for the next day. I hung up the phone, feeling my heart racing. Who could have done this? Steal my identity, take a $500,000 loan, and hope I wouldn't notice. An hour later, the phone rang. My daughter Helen's name popped up on the display. It was an odd coincidence. Daddy, her voice sounded unusually cheerful. Clive and I have decided to come over to your house for dinner tomorrow. It's nothing special. We just want to check up on you. Helen and her husband Clive usually visited me on the last Sunday of the month, no earlier and no later. This sudden visit in the middle of the month was so out of character that my suspicions were only heightened. Of course, darling, I replied, trying to sound nonchalant. I'll be glad to see you. Hanging up the phone, I sank heavily into my chair. My daughter is a real estate agent and her husband is a financial advisor. They've always lived large, always complaining about not having enough money to buy their dream home. And now, someone has taken out a loan in my name, and Helen has suddenly decided to make an unscheduled visit. Coincidence? I don't think so. Helen's always been a difficult child. Even as a child, she treated me with a certain disdain, preferring my mother's company. And after Doris died, she stopped hiding her irritation. Every advice I gave her was an attempt to control her life, every remark a criticism. Dad, you're 72 years old, she'd say when I tried to share my opinion of her career. Times have changed. What worked in the last century is useless now. I learned to keep quiet when she launched into her tirades about how hard it was for her and Clive to live in a rented apartment, how unfair it was that others could afford luxury homes and they had to scrimp. The truth was that they weren't saving at all. New cars, designer clothes, vacations twice a year. Money was slipping through their fingers, and they felt that everyone else was to blame but themselves. Clive was just like my daughter. Tall, with perfectly styled hair and a memorized smile, he always addressed me with a feigned respect that masked impatience. He called me sir, but the look in his eyes said, "When will you finally leave?" One day I overheard them talking when they thought I was dozing off in my chair. "How long do you think he has left?" Clive asked, lowering his voice. "I don't know," Helen replied. "His father lived to be 88. That's another 16 years. Jesus, Clive sighed. 16 years on this wreck while we could have been— They stopped talking when they noticed that I'd moved. This wreck, as they called my house, was the result of 30 years of hard work. I had designed it myself, personally supervising every stage of construction. It was where my children were born and raised, where I spent my happy years with Doris. Sure, it wasn't up to modern standards of luxury, but it was sturdy, spacious, and full of memories. My other children, sons Reed and Perry, were no better off. They lived in other cities and called once a month, clearly marking this task off their to-do list. Like programmed robots, they inquired about my health, talked about their children and work, and then quickly ended the conversation, citing busyness. My grandchildren thought I was a relic from another era. Granddaughter Sage, Reed's daughter, once asked if it was true that there was no internet in my time and was genuinely surprised to learn that I knew how to use a smartphone. "Wow, Grandpa, you're so advanced for your age," she said in the tone she used to praise a dog for a trick. But I wasn't the helpless old man they saw me as. I still remembered how to build a house from foundation to roof, could fix almost any breakdown, read modern literature, and kept up with the news. It's just that, in their eyes, my age overrode all my accomplishments and abilities. That night, I couldn't sleep. The thought that my own daughter could have taken out a loan in my name seemed both absurd and frighteningly real. How could she forge my signature? How could the bank believe that I, a man who had never taken a loan, had suddenly decided to borrow a huge sum of money? In the morning, I went to the bank. The manager, Mr. Holt, met me with an expression of polite skepticism on his face. He was young, about 35, with a neat beard and an expensive suit. "Mr. Nightingale, I understand your concern, but all the paperwork is in order," he said, looking through my file. "Here's your signature, and here's a copy of your ID." He turned the folder toward me. The signature did look like mine, but I knew for a fact that I hadn't put it there. Next to it was a copy of my driver's license. "It's a forgery," I said firmly. "I never signed those documents or authorized the use of my personal information." Mr. Holt sighed and folded his hands on the table. "Sir, you were here on the 2nd of May, Thursday. You were accompanied by a woman who identified herself as your daughter. You both spoke with our loan officer, Miss Parker. On May 2nd, I was indeed in town. Helen invited me to lunch, something she hadn't done in months. She was unusually attentive, interested in my affairs, even offered me a ride home. Now I understood why. May I speak to Miss Parker?" I asked. "Sure." Mr. Holt pressed a button on the phone and called the employee. A few minutes later, a young woman entered the office. She looked at me and nodded. "Yes, this is the client I've been working with," she confirmed. Mr. Nightingale and his daughter were applying for a real estate loan. "I've never met you before," I exclaimed. "Is there some mistake or—" I hesitated, not wanting to accuse the bank employee of aiding and abetting fraud. Miss Parker looked genuinely surprised. "Sir, we talked for about an hour. You were talking about how you wanted to help your daughter buy a house." I shook my head, feeling the blood rush to my face with anger and helplessness. "Look," I said, trying to speak calmly, "I'm a retired civil engineer. I've never borrowed a dime in my entire life. What makes you think that at the age of 72 I suddenly decided to borrow $500,000? Mr. Holt and Miss Parker exchanged glances. "You said you wanted to help your daughter buy a house," Miss Parker repeated. Given your credit history and assets, the bank approved the application. Someone was impersonating me, I insisted. My daughter had probably found someone who looked like me, or I stopped, realizing how crazy that sounded. Mr. Nightingale, Mr. Holt said in the tone he used to soothe irritated customers. Perhaps you've simply forgotten about this visit? At your age? At my age, I can still tell the truth from a lie, young man, I cut him off. I'll be filing a police report for fraud and identity theft. Mr. Holt straightened up. That's your right, sir. But I must warn you that if the investigation shows that you did sign those documents and now you're trying to renege, the consequences could be serious. I stood up, leaning on the cane I'd started using after a small fall last winter. I am prepared for any consequences because I know the truth. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to get ready for my daughter's visit. On the way home, I wondered how Helen could have pulled off such a scam. She must have found someone to impersonate me. But how could she get a copy of my papers? And where did the money go? That evening, when Clive's shiny black Audi showed up in the driveway, I already knew what I was going to do. I wouldn't make a scene. I wouldn't show that I knew anything. The whole truth had to come out first. Helen entered first, holding a box of cake from the local bakery. She looked tense despite her wide smile. Clive followed her, carrying a bottle of wine. Dad, Helen kissed me on the cheek. You look good. For your age, Clive added with a chuckle. Just fine, Helen corrected him with a warning glance. I invited them into the living room where the table was already set. A simple dinner of baked chicken and vegetables, nothing fancy. Helen immediately began fussing over plates and cutlery. Daddy, why are you using those old plates? You have a new set that we gave you for Christmas. Habit, I answered. An old dog doesn't learn new tricks. Clive laughed a little too loudly. True. But sometimes change is good, isn't it, Ezra? He's never called me by my first name before. Always Sir or Mr. Nightingale. This sudden shift to a friendly tone only heightened my suspicions. So, I began as we sat down at the table, how's your search for the house going? Helen almost choked on her wine. Oh, you remember? We're still looking. The market's so tough right now. Yes, prices are going up, Clive said. But we're optimistic. You're right, I nodded. You know, I was at the bank today. There was a pause. Helen froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. At the bank? She asked again. Why? I got a strange letter about a loan I'd supposedly taken out. $500,000, can you imagine? Clive let out a nervous laugh. Wow, must be some kind of mistake. That's exactly what I thought, I agreed. Someone had used my name, my identity, introduced himself as me at the bank. Helen set her glass down on the table too sharply, spilling the wine. Terrible. Did you go to the police? I'm going tomorrow, I lied, watching their reactions. The bank's already launched an internal investigation. They've got security footage. They'll have an expert verify the signature. The fraudsters aren't going anywhere. Helen's face turned pale and Clive began tapping his fingers nervously on the table. Dad, maybe we shouldn't worry. Helen tried to smile. At your age, that kind of worry is bad for your heart. Maybe I can help. Sort out the bank, all that paperwork. There's no need, dear. I patted her hand affectionately. I'm perfectly capable of defending myself. Besides, I have a friend in the police department who promised to take care of the case personally. That was another lie. I didn't have any friends in the police department, but I wanted to see their reaction, and it exceeded all expectations. The police? Clive turned pale. But maybe there really is some mistake? Maybe we should deal with the bank first. No, I shook my head. This is clearly a fraud. Someone forged my signature, posing as me. It's a serious crime, and the perpetrators must be punished. Dinner continued in a tense atmosphere. Helen and Clive exchanged glances, barely touching their food. They left just after dessert, citing an early rise. When the door closed behind them, I sank heavily into the chair. There was no doubt about it. My daughter had stolen my identity, taken out a huge loan in my name. There was only one question. What had she done with the money? The next day, I called my old friend Rodney Wilshire, with whom I had worked on dozens of projects. He'd become a private investigator after retirement, dealing mostly with adultery and insurance fraud. "Rodney, I need your help," I said, explaining the situation. "Jesus, Ezra," he grumbled. "Your own daughter? Are you sure about that?" "Pretty sure. But I need proof. And I also need to know where the money went." "I'll look into it," Rodney promised. "Give me a few days." I hung up the phone and stared out the window. It was a beautiful spring day outside, but I felt heavy. How had we gotten to the point where my daughter decided to steal from me? What had I done wrong in raising her? Or was it not me, but the world that had taught her that money was more important than family ties? The ringing of the phone snapped me out of my musings. The name of Chesapeake Financial Bank popped up on the screen. I stared at the phone until it stopped ringing. I didn't feel like talking to the bank right now. There were too many emotions bubbling up inside. I had to get all the facts first and then act. That's the way I'd always worked. Methodical, thorough. 40 years of construction had taught me that haste would cause even the strongest structures to collapse. 3 days later, Rodney called me himself. "Ezra, I have some information. It's best if we meet in person." We agreed to meet at a small cafe on the outskirts of Chesapeake, a place Helen rarely visited. She and her husband preferred the fancy restaurants downtown. Rodney looked the same as he had 30 years ago, stout, with a thick gray mustache and a tenacious gaze. Only the wrinkles were gone, and his back was a little hunched. He put a thick folder on the table. "You were right, old boy. Your daughter and that hubby of hers had pulled off a whole operation." Rodney opened the folder. Inside were photographs, copies of documents, and printouts. "Let's start with the main one. The money was used to buy a house in Greenbrier, the most upscale neighborhood in the Chesapeake. $450,000. The other 50, apparently, for furnishings and other expenses. He showed me a picture of a luxurious 2-story mansion with white columns and manicured gardens. "The deal closed 4 days ago. The house is in the name of Clive Pemberton. Not Helen, mind you, just her husband." This revelation hurt me. So Clive had the foresight to put the house in his own name in case of divorce or other problems. Helen is so blinded by this man that she can't see the basics. How did she do it, Rodney? How did she impersonate me? Rodney sighed and pulled another document out of the folder. "This is where it gets interesting. Helen has your power of attorney, Ezra. A general power of attorney that authorizes her to act on your behalf in almost all financial matters." "What?" I felt the blood drain from my face. "I never gave her that power of attorney." "According to the paperwork, you executed it with Lindsay Brooks, notary public, on December 6th of last year." I jogged my memory. December 6th. That was the day Helen took me to the doctor. My blood pressure had spiked, and she insisted on seeing a cardiologist. On the way, she asked me to stop by the notary to sign some papers for the sale of her client's house. "She tricked me," I said slowly. "I signed some paperwork, but she said it was for her job, that she needed a witness signature." Rodney nodded understandingly. "It's a classic scheme, taking advantage of an elderly relative's trust. You're not the only one, Ezra. Who else was at the notary's office that day? There should have been a second witness." "Perry," Rodney answered. "Your middle son." That news hit even harder. Not only Helen, but Perry was in on the deception. My own son. "So it's a family conspiracy." I grinned bitterly. "Who else knows?" "Apparently only Helen, Perry, and Clive. Your eldest, Reed, doesn't seem to be involved. At least, I couldn't find any trace of his involvement." I sipped my cold coffee, trying to calm down. So Helen used a fake power of attorney to get a loan in my name. Perry helped her with the paperwork. The money was used to buy a house for Clive. Now they've got a luxury mansion and I've got $500,000 in debt that I'll have to pay off for the rest of my life, unless I can prove fraud. What does the notary say? I asked. Have you talked to her? I tried. Rodney shook his head. Miss Brooks quit 2 months ago. Went to California. Didn't leave any contact info. Very convenient, I said. Too convenient, Rodney agreed. I'll check her out more thoroughly. Maybe Helen paid her for the favor. We were quiet for a moment. At the next table, a young couple was laughing on their phones. So carefree, so happy. Doris and I were like that once. What are you going to do, Ezra? Rodney finally asked. Good question. I could go to the police, file fraud charges. Helen would probably get probation as a first offender. Perry, too. Clive would probably get away with it. He could claim he didn't know the origin of the money. The house would have had to be sold to pay off the debt, but that would mean a public scandal. My children are criminals, and I'm an old man who's been cheated by his own offspring. Humiliating. There was another problem. Proof. The power of attorney looked legitimate. My signature, or a very good forgery, was on all the documents. The notary had disappeared. The bank believes I personally signed the papers. I need to talk to a lawyer, I said. Can you recommend a good one? Oliver Bristow, Rodney answered without hesitation. We've worked together on a few cases. He specializes in fraud and family law. Perfect for your situation. I wrote down the name and phone number. Rodney gathered the paperwork back into a folder and handed it to me. Here are copies of everything I found. The originals are in my safe in case you need them for court. Thanks, Rodney. How much do I owe you? He waved me off. Forget it. Consider it a favor for the time you saved me from getting fired by covering up my mistake in calculating the foundation for the Hampton Mall. That was 40 years ago, I smiled. I have a good memory for good deeds. He patted me on the shoulder. Keep me posted. And be careful with Helen and Clive. People capable of such fraud can be dangerous when they're backed into a corner. After my meeting with Rodney, I drove home feeling a strange mixture of anger, frustration, and strangely enough, relief. I now knew exactly what had happened. Uncertainty is always worse than the truth, no matter how bitter it is. At home, I spread out on the table all the papers Rodney had given me. The pictures of the house were impressive. A spacious Georgian-style mansion with a pool in the backyard and a 3-car garage. The house Helen had always dreamed of, which she decided to get at my expense. A copy of the sales contract showed that the deal had indeed closed a few days ago. Clive Pemberton was listed as the sole owner. The loan documents were in my name, but Helen's signature was in the trustee's signature section. She hadn't even tried to forge my signature. She just used a power of attorney. I called Oliver Bristow and made an appointment for the next day. Then I did what usually helped me think. I took out an old notebook and started writing, making plans, considering options, assessing the consequences. Plan 1, formal charges. Pros, justice, opportunity to clear my debt. Cons, public embarrassment, family scandal, difficulties with evidence. Plan 2, private settlement. Pros, no publicity, saving face. Cons, Helen and Clive may not cooperate, no guarantee of repayment. Plan 3, this got me thinking. What if we use their own weapons against them? The power of attorney Helen got by fraud is still valid. I could... The doorbell rang, interrupting my musings. Perry, my middle son, stood on the doorstep. He rarely visited me unannounced. Dad, he smiled awkwardly. I was driving by and thought I'd stop by. May I come in? I stepped back silently, letting him into the house. Perry looked tense. In his 43 years, he was starting to go bald and gray was showing in his dark hair. Working for an insurance company and a failed marriage had aged him prematurely. What's up, Dad? He asked, sitting down in the chair across from me. Fine, I said, staring at him. And you? I'm fine. He avoided my gaze. I just thought I'd check on you. Helen said you had a nice dinner the other night. Yeah, so Helen sent him to see if I was going to go to the police. Yeah, it was a pleasure, I said. By the way, it's been a long time since you've been to the notary with me. The last time was when? December? Perry shuddered. He'd always been a bad liar. Yep, I don't remember exactly. Maybe. December 6th, I prompted. You and Helen took me to Lindsay Brooks' notary. Do you remember what I signed there? Perry went pale. Some papers for Helen, for her client. It was a power of attorney, Perry. A general power of attorney authorizing Helen to handle my finances. The power of attorney she'd used to take out a $500,000 loan on my behalf. He stared at me with his mouth open. Either he really didn't know about the loan, or he was a better actor than I thought. Dad, I didn't know about the loan, I swear. Helen said you need to sign a power of attorney in case something happens to you, so she could help you with your affairs. And you believe that? Yes, I mean, why not? She's your daughter. I shook my head. And you're my son. And you helped her trick me. Perry jumped up. No, I didn't know what she was planning. I thought it was really for your own good. For my good, I repeated slowly. $500,000 of debt at 72 years old is for my good? Debt? He looked genuinely surprised. What debt? Helen took out a loan in my name. A loan that I'll have to pay off for the rest of my life. And then the burden will probably be passed on to you, my children. Unless, of course, you renounce your inheritance. Perry collapsed back into his chair. Jesus, I didn't know. I swear, Dad, I didn't know. Maybe he was telling the truth. Perry had always been the weakest of my children, easily influenced, especially by Helen, who had been able to manipulate his brothers since they were children. What did she pay you? I asked. Nothing. He seemed offended. She just said it was important for your safety, that you were becoming forgetful. Forgetful, I hummed. I remember by heart all the specs for the 62 buildings I've designed in my career. I remember the birthday of each of my grandchildren. I even remember your 8th grade school locker number 217. Perry lowered his head. I'm sorry, Dad, I had to check. I should have made sure you knew what you were signing. Yeah, I should have, I agreed. Now tell me, what do you know about the house in Greenbrier? He looked up at me in surprise. Greenbrier? Nothing. Why? Helen and Clive bought a house there, with the money from a loan in my name. A house? Perry looked confused. But they said they couldn't even afford an apartment in a nice neighborhood. Obviously, they lied, as much to you as to me. The next 3 days flew by in a flurry of preparations. Oliver Bristow turned out to be not just a good lawyer, but a legal wizard. He filed an urgent application with the court, challenging the legality of the transaction and seeking a temporary injunction that gave me access to the house until the dispute was fully resolved. Judge Harrison always favors elderly people who are victims of fraud, Oliver explained to me over the phone Thursday night. He signed the injunction this afternoon. We'll get the keys to the house tomorrow morning. That fast? I was surprised at the speed of the process. It's a temporary measure, Oliver clarified. We didn't win the case. We just got the use of the house until the final judgment. But it gives us a tactical advantage for negotiations. Friday morning, Oliver arrived at my house with a small box in his hands. Inside were 2 shiny keys. Congratulations on your housewarming, he said with a smile. There's one condition, though. You must actually live in the house, or the injunction will become null and void. That's not a problem, I replied, weighing the keys in the palm of my hand. I've already packed. Indeed, the night before, I had packed the essentials, clothes, toiletries, medication, a couple of books, and a silver-framed picture of Doris. It all fit into one large suitcase and bag. It's not a lot to take in 72 years of life. Are you sure you can handle it? Oliver asked, looking at me with concern. Confrontation can be tense. I can handle it, I nodded. It wouldn't be the first time I'd faced an uncomfortable conversation. When you manage construction crews for 40 years, you learn to hold your punches. Oliver helped me load my stuff into his car, and we headed for Greenbrier. On the way, he explained the legal intricacies of the situation. Technically, your brother-in-law owns the house, but the loan is in your name, which means you are financially responsible. We're challenging the legitimacy of the loan on the grounds that your signature on the power of attorney was fraudulently obtained. If we can prove this, the loan will be invalidated and the bank will repossess the house. And if we can't, then we'll have to devise another strategy. Maybe a criminal prosecution for fraud and forgery, or a civil suit against the daughter and son-in-law. But right now, our goal is to catch them off guard and get them to the negotiating table. Greenbrier turned out to be exactly as I'd envisioned: perfectly mowed lawns, stately homes hidden behind hedges, expensive cars in the driveways. A neighborhood for those who wanted to show off their status and wealth. Number 14. Oakwood Drive stood out even from the other luxurious mansions. 2 stories high, with white columns at the entrance and huge windows, it looked like a miniature version of the White House. The driveway was paved with expensive cobblestones, and in the courtyard stood a marble fountain bowl, still dry. "Impressive," Oliver whistled as he parked at the entrance. "Your daughter clearly has good taste and appetites." "She's always wanted to live better than she could afford," I replied, struggling to get out of Oliver's low sports car. My cane caught on the door and I almost fell. "Careful," Oliver picked me up. "You don't want to get hurt before the show starts." We arrived at the front door, a solid dark wood door with stained glass inserts. I put the key in the lock and it turned easily. The door opened silently, as if inviting me in. Inside, the house was even more impressive than the outside. A spacious hall with a marble floor, a wide staircase leading to the second floor, a crystal chandelier under the high ceiling. All the furniture was new, expensive, tastefully chosen: leather sofas, antique tables, designer lamps. "They've already furnished the house," I remarked, walking from the hallway into the living room. With your money," Oliver reminded me. We walked around the first floor: the living room, the dining room, the kitchen, the study, even a small movie room with a projector and cushioned chairs. Then we went up to the second floor, where the bedrooms were located. The master bedroom took up almost a third of the floor, with a huge bed, a walk-in closet, and a bathroom the size of my kitchen. "I think this is going to be my room," I said, setting my suitcase by the bed. "Great choice," Oliver grinned. "A master bedroom for the true master of the house." I unpacked, putting the clothes in the empty dresser drawers, putting Doris's picture on the bedside table. Oliver, meanwhile, checked the contents of the refrigerator in the kitchen. "They've already filled it," he said when I came downstairs. "Probably getting ready for the housewarming party. There's enough food in there for the next few days." "That's good," I nodded. "I wouldn't have to go shopping." Oliver checked his watch. "I should go. I have a meeting at the office in an hour. Are you sure you can handle it here alone?" "Of course," I assured him. "I'll just wait for the guests. After all, this is my house, isn't it?" Oliver smiled and shook my hand. "Technically, yes, at least until the court decides. Call me if you have any problems, and try not to escalate the situation. Our goal is negotiation, not war." After Oliver left, I was alone in a huge house. It was a strange feeling being in such a luxurious place, knowing it was bought with money stolen from you. I walked through the rooms looking at details I hadn't noticed on my first inspection. Pictures of Helen and Clive on the walls, on vacation in exotic countries, at some receptions, in expensive restaurants. Not a single picture of me or Doris. Not a single reminder of the family that raised them. In the study, I found a safe built into the wall behind a painting. A typical solution, and so predictable. Sure, it was locked, but I wondered what they considered valuable enough to hide. Deeds to the house, jewelry, money. In the desk, I found a folder with the deeds to the house. Looking through them, I was convinced that Rodney was right. The house was really only registered to Clive. Helen wasn't even listed as a co-owner. An interesting choice for a married couple, or maybe not so odd for a man who planned alternate exits. Time passed slowly. I settled down in the living room with a book I'd grabbed off the shelf, some fancy thriller, clearly unread, bought for looks. The sun was gradually moving across the sky, casting long shadows through the large windows. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I heard the sound of a car pulling up. Looking out the window, I saw Clive's black Audi stopping in the driveway. The show was starting. I adjusted my tie. I'd dressed extra carefully today, in my best suit, the one I only wore to weddings and funerals. I smoothed my gray hair and stood at the door, leaning on my cane more for effect than necessity. The keys jingled, the door opened, and Helen and Clive appeared on the doorstep, laden with bags of food and drink. They didn't immediately notice me, busy talking. "I think that's enough champagne," Helen said. "Perry promised to bring ice and Reed." She stopped halfway through the conversation when she finally saw me. Her face was frozen in an expression of absolute shock, the bag slipping out of her hands and falling to the floor. The champagne bottle shattered, liquid spilling over the marble floor. "Daddy?" Her voice was barely audible. "Hello, Helen," I smiled. "Hello, Clive. Welcome to my new home. Or maybe yours." I was getting confused, to be honest. Clive died first. His face contorted with anger. "What the hell? How did you get in here?" "With a key, of course." I showed him the keychain I still held in my hand. "Very convenient lock, by the way. Good choice." "Where did you get the keys?" Helen was finally able to speak. "Dad, what's going on?" "Oh, I think you know exactly what's going on." I took a step forward, stepping into a puddle of champagne. "You know, I got a very interesting letter from the bank the other day. Something about a $500,000 loan I supposedly took out. It's funny, isn't it? Especially since I've never taken out a loan in my life." Helen turned even paler, if that was even possible. "Dad, I can explain." "I'm sure you can." I nodded. "You've always had great explanations. Remember when you explained why you took my credit card at 16 without asking, or at 22 when you sold Mom's jewelry while we were on vacation?" "That's different," Helen objected. "We were going to explain everything, just waiting for the right time." "Really?" I raised an eyebrow. "And when would that opportune moment be? A year from now? 5 years from now? After I was dead?" Clive stepped forward, trying to look threatening. "Look, Ezra, you have no right to be here. This house belongs to me, and I can call the police." "Call them," I shrugged. "I'll be happy to explain to the officers how my dear children forged a power of attorney to take out a $500,000 loan in my name. I'm sure they'll find the story fascinating." The guests began to arrive one by one. I watched as Helen and Clive tried to maintain a semblance of control over the situation. They smiled, greeted friends and family, gave tours of the house, but I could see the tension in their eyes and the stiffness in their movements. Every time someone asked about my presence, Helen repeated a prepared lie. I had come to help with the housewarming, to give advice on how to organize the house. I didn't deny it, but I didn't confirm it either, letting it hang in the air like a sword of Damocles over the heads of my ungrateful children. Perry avoided looking me in the eye. He kept to himself, nervously sipping whiskey from a crystal glass. His wife, Samantha, who wasn't privy to the details of the situation, cast perplexed glances at me. Apparently, my sudden appearance in the house, about which her husband had said nothing, seemed strange to her. Soon my oldest son, Reed, arrived with his wife Prudence and their 2 teenage children. Reed was the only one of my children who seemed genuinely happy to see me. He gave me a big hug, something he hadn't done in years. "Dad, "I didn't expect to see you here," he said with a smile. "You look good. New suit?" "Old," I said. "I just don't wear it much. I save it for special occasions." Reed was a high school history teacher, the only one of my children who'd chosen a modest but honorable profession. He never chased wealth, content with what he had. Perhaps that's why his attitude toward me was always more respectful. He didn't have to be jealous or wait for an inheritance. "How are you, Papa?" he asked, taking me aside. "It's been a while. I'm sorry, work kids, you know?" "I understand," I nodded. "We all have our own worries. How long have you known Helen's new place?" Reed asked, looking around with undisguised surprise. I hadn't expected her and Clive to be able to afford that. I could hear the genuine bewilderment in his voice. So Reed really hadn't been aware of Helen's scam. That reassured me a little. At least, not all my kids were willing to cheat their old man father. "I'll have a chance to tell you more about this house," I replied evasively. "A little later, when everyone is gathered." By 7 o'clock in the evening, the house was full of guests, about 30 people. Besides my children and their families, there were Helen's colleagues from the real estate agency, several of Clive's clients, neighbors from the new neighborhood, and even a couple of reporters from the local newspaper who had been invited to cover the housewarming party of a successful financial advisor and his wife. Helen was getting more and more nervous. I could see her casting anxious glances in my direction, trying to anticipate my actions. Clive was more confident, but there was a nervousness in his demeanor too. He laughed too loudly, poured himself too much whiskey, bragged too insistently about his new house. "This is real cedar from Lebanon," he said, pointing to the wood paneling in the study. "It cost a fortune, but Helen and I think you can't skimp on things like that." "You can't skimp on things like honesty," I said, stealthily coming up behind him. "Isn't that right, Clive?" He flinched and turned around, smiling strainedly. "Of course, Ezra. Absolutely agree." The guests looked at each other, sensing the tension, but wrote it off as a normal family disagreement. As everyone gathered in the spacious living room for a toast, I decided my moment had arrived. Helen stood in the center of the room with a glass of champagne, preparing to make a speech. Clive froze beside her, his arm resting possessively around her waist. They looked like the perfect couple who had achieved success, if you didn't know the dark history behind the facade. "Dear friends and family," Helen began, her voice trembling slightly, "Clive and I are so happy to welcome you to our new home. It's been a dream of ours for many years, and it's finally come true. If I may," I interrupted her, raising my glass. "I'd like to say a few words too." Helen froze, her face pale. Clive gripped her waist tighter as if trying to keep her from falling. "Of course, Daddy," she forced out a smile. "Please." I walked to the center of the room, leaning on my cane. All eyes were on me. An old man in a strict suit with a straight back and a clear gaze. "For those who don't know me," I began, looking around the room, "I'm Ezra Nightingale, Helen's father, and I have a lot to tell you about this wonderful house." I paused, savoring the moment. Helen and Clive froze like statues, their smiles turned into petrified masks. "This house," I continued, "is really special. Do you know why? Because it was bought with money borrowed in my name, without my knowledge or consent." There was a silence in the room, a silence so deep you could hear the water dripping from the kitchen faucet. The faces of the guests expressed bewilderment, shock, disbelief. "Daddy," Helen stepped forward, her voice sounding pleading, "you don't know what you're saying. Maybe you need to lie down." "I know exactly what I'm saying," I cut her off. "And my lawyer has all the paperwork to prove it." Helen, with the help of a forged power of attorney, took out a $500,000 loan in my name. That money went to buy this house, which, by the way, is in Clive's name only, not even the two of them. The guests began to look around, whispering. A reporter from the local paper discreetly took out a notebook and began to write something down. "Ezra," Clive stepped forward, his face contorted with anger. You're forgetting yourself. That's not true, and you know it. We paid for this house ourselves. You did? I raised an eyebrow. Then why is the loan agreement in my name? Why does the bank have my signature on it, signed the day I was fishing in Norfolk? Why has the notary who certified the power of attorney mysteriously disappeared? There was an exclamation of surprise among the guests. Perry looked like he was about to faint. Reed frowned, shifting his gaze from me to Helen. Helen, Reed's voice was quiet but firm. Is it true? Helen opened her mouth but couldn't utter a word. Her eyes filled with tears. Her makeup began to blur. It's a lie, Clive blurted out. Your father is out of his mind. He's jealous of our success, that's all. Jealous? I laughed. Jealous of what? Your ability to deceive? Your skill at forging documents? Or maybe your ability to steal from your own family? The reporter was scribbling in his notebook at the speed of light. This story was clearly more interesting than he expected. I think we all need to calm down, Prudence, Reed's wife, intervened. Maybe it's just a misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, I said. I have proof, and a court order that gives me the right to stay in this house until the dispute is resolved. That's why I'm here today, not as a guest, but as the rightful owner. Helen finally found the strength to speak. Dad, please, her voice trembled. Let's discuss this some other time, some other place. Not now, not here. When? I asked. When you decide that the right time has come. No, Helen, the truth doesn't wait for the right moment. It just is. I looked around at the guests. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this unpleasant surprise. I didn't mean to spoil the evening, but I believe the truth is more important than social convention. This house was purchased with money obtained by fraud, and while I hope to settle this matter amicably, I want everyone to know that I intend to live here for the rest of my life. A house that will be paid for by me, not by my children who are in such a hurry to get rid of a burdensome father. There was a heavy pause. Then one by one the guests began to bow out, muttering apologies and awkward goodbyes. The reporters were the last to leave, casting sympathetic glances at Helen and Clive that promised tomorrow's headlines. When only family members were left in the house, a storm broke out. How could you? Helen shouted, her face contorted with rage and humiliation. You ruined our reputation. You destroyed everything we spent years building. Me? I raised my eyebrows. I wasn't the one who took out a loan in someone else's name. I wasn't the one who cheated my own father. Helen, Reed walked over to his sister, his face serious. Is it true? Did you really do what Dad says you did? Helen lowered her eyes, unable to bear her brother's gaze. We were going to fix it, she muttered. We'd pay off the loan ourselves, he wouldn't even know. Oh, God! Reed took a step back, his face a mixture of shock and disgust. You really did it. You stole from your own father. Don't be dramatic, Clive interjected, his voice sounding annoyed. No one stole from anyone. We just used his credit history to get better terms. We'd pay all the installments ourselves. And if you couldn't? Reed asked. If you'd lost your job, or decided it was too onerous, who would pay then? Dad? Clive was silent, and that was more eloquent than any answer. Perry, who had been silent until then, suddenly spoke up. It's my fault, too, he said quietly. I helped them with the power of attorney. I didn't know what it was really for, but I should have known. Reed shifted his gaze to his middle brother, his face a look of disbelief. You too? God, what has our family become? Helen was suddenly in tears, her shoulders shaking with sobs. We just wanted a better life, she sobbed. We were so tired of living in a rented apartment when everyone else had their own houses. So earn it, Reed said, like normal people. Prudence and I saved for our house for 10 years. It's 10 times more modest than this one, but it's ours, honestly earned. I watched the scene with a kind of detached interest. My children fought like they did when they were kids, only the stakes were higher. No longer toys or candy, but $500,000 and the family's reputation. What happens now? Samantha, Perry's wife, asked, looking at me apprehensively. Will you sue? That's up to Helen and Clive, I replied. I've offered them a way out. Sign the house over to me, take over the loan payments, and publicly acknowledge that I bought the house. If they agree, we can settle this amicably. And if they don't? Reed asked. Then there'll be a trial, and not just civil, but criminal. Forgery, fraud, identity theft are serious charges. Helen looked up at me with a tear-stained face. Would you really send your daughter to prison? Her voice trembled. Would you really condemn your father to $500,000 in debt at 72? I parried. Apparently, we were both capable of more than we thought of each other. There was a heavy silence in the room. Then Clive suddenly laughed, a dry, mirthless laugh. Do you know what the funny thing is? He said, looking around at everyone. If we'd just asked Ezra to help with the down payment, he probably would have agreed. But Helen was sure he'd say no, that he was too greedy, too fond of control. So we chose this path. I looked at Clive with surprise. He was right. If they'd asked, I would have helped. Not with $500,000, of course, but with a down payment, quite possibly. I'd always wanted my children to be happy and successful. But Helen chose deception. And now what? Perry asked, shifting his gaze from me to Helen. Do we just split up? Stop being a family? The question hung in the air. I didn't know the answer. Can such a betrayal be forgiven? Can trust be rebuilt after such a deception? I suggest we all calm down and think about the situation, Reed finally said. We're all too excited to make any decisions right now. Reasonable, I agreed. Helen and Clive, you have until Monday to accept my offer. After that, I'll go to court. Where are we going to live? Helen asked, her voice sounding lost. If the house is yours. Where we used to live, I shrugged. In my rented apartment. Or you can stay here as my guests, as long as you follow my rules. Clive snorted. We're not going to live in our own house on a bird's license. My house, I corrected. A house bought with money borrowed under my name. Daddy, Irene, Reed's granddaughter, who had been silent until then, intervened suddenly. Can I come and visit you sometimes? It's so beautiful here. Everyone turned to the teenage girl who was looking at me with genuine interest. There was no judgment or fear in her eyes, just curiosity and maybe a little admiration. Of course, dear, I smiled. You're always welcome in my home. Cool, Irene smiled back. You're going to have the coolest house of any grandpa I know. That simple remark, said without a backward thought, broke the tension. A few people even smiled weakly. I think we should go, Reed said, putting his arm around his daughter's shoulders. Daddy, are you okay? Do you need anything? I'm fine, I assured him. I have everything I need. I'll call you tomorrow, Reed promised. We'll talk about it. Slowly, everyone began to disperse. Perry and Samantha were the first to leave without a word. Reed and his family stayed a little longer, promising support and help. Helen and Clive were the last to leave. Where's our stuff? Clive asked, his voice sounding tired. Your personal belongings you can take away, I answered. Everything else stays here. They went upstairs and returned half an hour later with 2 suitcases. Helen looked broken, her eyes red with tears. Daddy, she said, stopping at the door. I didn't mean for things to turn out this way. Neither did I answered honestly. But you made your choice, Helen. Now live with the consequences. They left, and I was alone in the huge, luxurious house, echoing through the empty rooms. It was a strange feeling, a victory that brought no joy, only the bitter satisfaction of justice restored. The next morning brought unexpected surprises. First was a call from Reed. Dad, did you see today's paper? He asked without preamble. No, I replied. What's in it? The article about last night's housewarming party. Front page. Headline, Greenbrier family scandal. Daughter scammed into taking out a loan in her father's name. I sighed. The reporters wasted no time. How bad is it? Quite detailed, Reed admitted. Helen and Clive are not in the best light. You, on the other hand, are described as a noble father deceived by his own children. An hour after that call, Perry showed up on the doorstep. He looked as if he had been up all night. "Dad," he said, shuffling nervously from foot to foot, "I've come to apologize, a real apology. What we did, what I helped to do, it's unforgivable." I stared at him in silence, waiting for him to continue. "I talked to a lawyer," Perry continued. "He said I'm looking at accessory to fraud, probation, a fine, maybe even a short prison sentence. And I'm willing to take the punishment. But first, I wanted to apologize to you." I was surprised. Perry had always been the weakest of my children, easily influenced by others. I didn't expect him to be so forthright and willing to take responsibility. "I appreciate your honesty, Perry," I said finally. "It's a good first step." "I'll testify against Helen and Clive if I have to," he added. "I'll tell it like it is." I could see that he was driven as much by remorse as by fear of the consequences, of prison, of losing his job and his reputation. But isn't that what I wanted? For my children to finally realize that their actions have consequences? Irene, Reed's granddaughter, arrived for lunch. A 16-year-old girl with brightly colored hair dyed purple and lots of bracelets on her wrists. "Hi, Grandpa," she said, entering the house with her backpack over her shoulders. "I thought I'd come visit you. May I?" Sure. I was happy to see her. Irene had always been my favorite. Bright, independent, with her own opinions on everything. "This is a great house," she said, looking around. "It's a shame Aunt Helen is so—" She hesitated for a word. "Helen like that?" I suggested. Irene laughed. "That's right. She's always been like that. Remember when on my 12th birthday she gave me a doll, when I was 12, and then told my mom I was rude because I didn't jump for joy?" I smiled, remembering the episode. Helen was always sure she knew best what others needed. "Are you staying for lunch?" I asked. "If you don't mind," Irene smiled. "I can help cook something. And then maybe you can tell me about your travels? Dad said you traveled halfway around the world when you were an engineer." "I'd love to," I agreed. We spent the afternoon together. I told her about my projects in different countries, the people I'd met, the adventures I'd had. Irene listened with genuine interest, asked intelligent questions, and shared her dreams for the future. She wanted to become an archaeologist, to study ancient civilizations, to uncover the secrets of the past. "You know, Grandpa," she said before leaving, "I'm glad you live here now. It's much closer to us than your old home. I'll be able to come see you more often." I hugged her, feeling an unexpected warmth in my chest. Maybe something good would come out of this whole scandal. Maybe I could finally get to really know my grandchildren, build a relationship with them that I didn't have with my children. That evening, Oliver Bristow, my lawyer, called. "How did the exposé go?" he asked without preamble. "Loud," I replied, "but effective. Helen and Clive are evicted, public opinion is on my side, even Perry is willing to testify against his sister." "Great," Oliver sounded pleased. "It strengthens our bargaining position. Helen's already contacted me. She wants to meet on Monday to discuss the terms of the agreement." "Does she agree to my terms?" "In principle, yes, but there are a few things she'd like to clarify, like what happens to the house after you're gone." "Well, after you're gone." I chuckled. Even now Helen was thinking about the inheritance. Tell her that I plan to live another 20 years at least, and that my plans for my inheritance are my own business. "I'd be happy to tell her," Oliver said, a smile in his voice. "I'll see you Monday, Ezra." It had been 2 months since that memorable evening when I'd opened the door to my hapless children. Life had changed dramatically, for me and for them. On Monday, as planned, there was a meeting with Helen, Clive, and our solicitors. They accepted all my terms without much objection. The house was transferred into my name, the loan repayments fell on their shoulders, and a public statement that I had bought the house, and they had only helped with the arrangements appeared in the same newspaper that had carried the news of the scandal. Clive sat stony-faced at this meeting, avoiding looking me in the eye. Helen tried to feign contrition, but I could see the underlying anger in her gaze. They signed all the papers and left without a word of farewell. I haven't seen or heard from them since, except for monthly notices from the bank about the loan payments. However, I heard about them from Reed, who, unlike Helen, continued to keep in touch with me. According to him, Clive had lost several important clients in the wake of the scandal. His reputation in financial circles was damaged. Who would trust their money to a man who had cheated his own father-in-law? Helen had to change her real estate agency. Her colleagues began to shun her, and clients refused to work with her. They sold their expensive car and moved to a more modest apartment to cope with the loan payments. I didn't gloat when I heard about their hardship, but I didn't feel pity either. They had made a choice and were now living with the consequences. Perry, my middle son, escaped serious punishment through a clean confession and cooperation with the authorities. He got probation and a fine, but kept his job at the insurance company. We began to communicate more often. He called every week, sometimes dropping by with his wife for dinner. There was something new in his attitude towards me, a respect that hadn't been there before. But the most amazing change occurred in my own life. I, a 72-year-old widower accustomed to a quiet existence in an old house, was suddenly the center of attention in the local community. The story of an elderly father deceived by his own daughter traveled all over the Chesapeake. Some saw me as a hero, defying age discrimination, others as a victim worthy of sympathy. But everyone was intrigued. Neighbors in Greenbrier, the upscale neighborhood where my house was now located, showed unexpected friendliness. The first to pay a visit was Eleanor Pritchett, a judge's widow who lived across the street. She brought homemade pie and invited me to the weekly meetings of the local book club. "We lack a male perspective on literature," she said, giving me an appraising look. "Most of our members are ladies of a certain age, like me. You'll bring a fresh perspective." I agreed, though I had never considered myself a great literary scholar. The first meeting of the club was a revelation. 6 women and 2 men, all over 60, discussed the latest novel by a popular author with such fervor and depth that I felt like a student in a seminar. They were arguing about symbolism, hidden meanings, comparing the novel to the classics. "What do you think, Ezra?" Eleanor asked when the discussion reached a peak. "I'm an engineer, not a literary scholar," I answered honestly. "Construction is more important to me than symbols. And in that sense, the book is well constructed, logical, consistent with the right distribution of tension, like a good bridge." There was a pause, and then everyone laughed, not mockingly but with pleasure, as if I'd said something unexpectedly apartment. "Fresh eyes," Eleanor nodded. "Just what we needed." After that, I became a regular member of the club. Reading the books they chose made me think differently, see the world from a new angle. I began to appreciate literature not only for its plot, but also for its depth, for its ability to reflect human nature. Another surprise was an invitation from Howard Kingsley, a retired architecture professor who lived down the street. He suggested I join a local amateur chess club that met twice a week at the Greenbrier Community Center. "I was told you were an engineer," he explained. "Engineers are usually good at spatial reasoning and strategy. You might make a good chess player." I hadn't played chess since college, but I decided to give it a try. I lost the first few games cleanly, but gradually I started to remember old skills and acquire new ones. After a month, I was already able to keep up with the average players in the club. Chess and book club are activities I never even thought about in my past life. Back then, My days were filled with routine and occasional drawn-out visits from the kids. Now, however, each week brought something new. Granddaughter Irene kept her promise and became a frequent visitor to my home. She came after school, did her homework in my office, and talked about her history and archaeology projects. Sometimes she stayed overnight in one of the guest bedrooms. Her brother Paul, a 14-year-old silent teenager, stayed away at first, but then he started dropping by too, especially after he found out I had a home theater with a huge screen. "Can I watch a movie with my friends?" he asked me one day, shuffling from foot to foot in the doorway of my office. "Sure," I agreed, "just not too loud and not too late." He brightened up and ran off to call his friends. That night, my house was filled with the sounds it had been missing. The laughter of young people, the cheers of excitement, the noisy arguments about the plot of the movie. I sat in my office listening to this cacophony and smiled. The house had come alive. Reed and his wife Prudence began to visit me more often, too. Sometimes as a family, sometimes just the two of them, like a date, leaving the kids at home. "You know, Dad," Reed said to me during one of these visits, "I've never seen you so happy, not even when Mom was alive." I pondered his words. Was I happy with Doris? Yes, absolutely. We loved each other, raised our children, built a life together. But in that happiness, there was always an admixture of obligation, of responsibility, of the need to meet expectations, our own and others. Now, at 72, I felt truly free for the first time, free from having to live up to someone else's expectations, free from the guilt of not being able to give my children everything they wanted, free from the fear of being a burden. "Maybe you're right," I said to my son. Maybe I had to go through all that to realize what true freedom was. I still hadn't heard from Helen, but one day I received a strange letter with no return address. Inside was just a postcard with a view of the ocean and a short note. "I'm sorry. Not about the house, but about what's between us." There was no signature, but I recognized Helen's handwriting. I didn't reply. Some bridges burned to the ground and can't be rebuilt. Clive, from what I'd heard from Perry, blamed Helen for everything. Their marriage was cracking at the seams under the pressure of financial problems and mutual recriminations. They had sold a few more expensive items to cope with loan payments and other debts accumulated from years of living beyond their means. "They're on the verge of divorce," Perry informed me during another visit. "Clive says it was all Helen's idea, that he didn't know about the forged power of attorney. Helen says he's been pressuring her for a big house and a prestigious address." "What do you think?" I asked. Perry shrugged his shoulders. "I think they're both guilty, and they both got what they deserved." I couldn't disagree with that assessment. Helen and Clive had always been a couple who lived for show, eager to impress others. Their marriage had been held together by shared ambition and a desire to rise above their status at any cost. Now that those ambitions had led to a collapse, they had nothing to build their relationship on. In the summer, 3 months into the whole affair, I decided to have a barbecue in the backyard of my new house. I invited the neighbors, friends from the chess and book clubs, Reed and his family, Perry and his wife. I didn't invite Helen and Clive, but I wouldn't forbid them to come if they dared. The day was sunny and warm. The patio with its pool and barbecue area was perfect for such an event. Irene helped me with the preparations, setting up tables and chairs, decorating the space with garlands and flowers. "Grandpa, this is going to be the best party ever," she declared as she attached the last garland. "Too bad Grandma can't see it." I smiled, imagining what Doris would say if she saw me in this gorgeous house, surrounded by my new friends. "She'd be surprised," I said, "but I think she'd like it." The guests started arriving after 4. Eleanor Pritchett brought her famous apple pie, Howard Kingsley a bottle of fine scotch. Reed and his family were among the first to arrive, helping with the final preparations. Perry and Samantha had brought salads and appetizers. To my surprise, Rodney Wilshire, my old friend and the private investigator who'd started this whole thing, was among the guests. I couldn't miss it, he explained, shaking my hand firmly. I wanted to see for myself how you were settling in. The party was a great success. People of all ages and backgrounds socialized, laughed, and enjoyed the food and drink. Paul and his friends splashed in the pool. Adults discussed books, politics, and local news. I moved from group to group, feeling like the master of not only my home, but my life. At one point, Rodney pulled me aside. "You know, Ezra," he said, glancing around, "when you came to me with this story, I thought it would end in a big scandal and broken hearts. But look what happened. You found a new life." "I did," I agreed, "although the price was high." "Sometimes you have to pay a high price for freedom," Rodney said philosophically. "Especially freedom from toxic relationships." He was right. I'd lost my daughter, or rather, I'd lost the illusion of a relationship with her that never really existed. But in return, I gained a real connection with other family members, new friends, new interests, and most importantly, respect for myself. As the sun began to set, we lit the lanterns in the garden and continued the party. Someone turned on some music and couples started dancing on the patio. To my surprise, Eleanor Pritchett asked me to dance. "Don't just stand there, Ezra," she said with a smile. "You're the host of the party. You're supposed to dance." I hadn't danced since Doris died, but I found that my body remembered the moves. We moved smoothly to a slow tune, and I could feel the approving glances of the guests. "You're full of surprises, Ezra," Eleanor said when the dance was over. "Who would have thought a stern engineer could dance so well?" "I had a good teacher," I replied, thinking of Doris. "My wife loved to dance." "She was a lucky woman," Eleanor said seriously. "Not everyone is lucky enough to find a partner who is willing to learn new things." The party went on until late into the night. When the last guest left, I stayed out in the yard, sitting in a chair and looking at the stars. Reed came over and sat next to me. "Great night, Dad," he said. Everyone was thrilled. "Yeah, it was pretty good," I agreed. We talked for a while, enjoying the silence and the cool night air. "Do you miss Helen?" Reed asked suddenly. I wondered. Did I miss the daughter who treated me like a burden for years and then cheated me out of a huge sum of money? "I miss what we never had," I finally answered. "A real father-daughter relationship based on love and respect. But the Helen I knew? No, I don't." Reed nodded, understanding. "Sometimes family ties are poisonous," he said quietly, "and breaking them doesn't bring pain, but release." "Exactly," I agreed. "Liberation." We sat for a while longer, talking about life, about Reed's children, about his work. When he left, I stayed under the starry sky for a long time, pondering the strange twists and turns of fate. Who would have thought that at 72 my life would change so dramatically? That my daughter's betrayal would lead to finding a new family, not just blood relatives but friends who had become close. That I would find new hobbies, new joys, a new meaning of existence. The house bought with the money stolen from me became a symbol of my liberation. Here I was no longer a lonely old man living out my days. I was Ezra Nightingale, a man with a past and a future, with friends and interests, with my own voice and my own choices. The next morning I woke up with a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. Sipped coffee on the terrace, watching the garden awaken. Birds were singing in the branches of the trees. The sun was slowly rising above the horizon, coloring the sky in soft pink tones. At 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I opened it and saw the letter carrier with a large envelope. "Mr. Nightingale?" he asked. "A registered letter. Sign here, please." I signed my name and took the envelope. The sender was Chesapeake Financial Bank. Inside was a late payment notice on a loan. Helen and Clive hadn't made the last monthly installment. I sighed but felt neither anger nor disappointment. It was to be expected. Their financial problems were mounting and a sense of responsibility had never been their strong suit. I called Oliver Bristow, my attorney. They've missed a payment, I reported. What now? They have 30 days to pay the debt before the bank starts foreclosure proceedings, Oliver explained. But frankly, I was expecting that. According to my information, Clive lost his job 2 weeks ago. Lost his job? That was news to me. Yeah, his firm downsized, and he was among the first to be made redundant. His reputation's been badly damaged by the scandal. It got me thinking, what happens if they can't make the loan payments? According to our agreement, they had taken on that responsibility, but legally the loan was still in my name. What are my risks? I asked. If they stopped making payments altogether? Technically, the bank could make a claim against you, Oliver admitted. But we have a notarized agreement with Helen and Clive. If it comes to that, we'll sue them for breach of contract. And the house? The house is yours now, legally registered in your name. The bank can't take it without a lengthy lawsuit, and even then our chances of keeping it are high. That reassured me a little, but it left a taste of bitterness. Even now that our paths had parted, Helen and Clive continued to cause problems. Their irresponsibility could cost me the house that had become not just a roof over my head, but a symbol of a new life. That evening I was sitting in my office contemplating the situation when the phone rang. Helen's name popped up on the screen. I stared at it for a long time, hesitating to answer. Finally, taking a deep breath, I accepted the call. "Daddy?" Her voice sounded uncertain. "Did you get the letter from the bank?" "I did," I answered dryly. We're having temporary difficulties," she stammered, struggling to find the words. "Clive lost his job, and my commissions aren't even enough to cover the rent, let alone the loan. We're just asking for some time." "Time is all I've got left, Helen," I said, "and I'm not going to waste it on your problems. Daddy, please." I could hear the tears in her voice. "We'll fix it, I swear. We'll find the money. We'll pay every dime. Just, don't sue us. Not now. Not when everything's falling apart." I was silent as I listened to her sobs. Part of me wanted to comfort my daughter, to tell her everything would be okay. But the other part, the part that remembered the years of neglect and the final betrayal, remained firm. "You have 30 days under the bank's terms," I said at last. "Use them wisely." I hung up without waiting for an answer. Perhaps it was cruel, but I no longer believed Helen's promises. I was protecting myself, my home, my new life, and if that required being tough, so be it. The next day I met with Oliver and discussed options. We decided to prepare the court papers but not file them yet, giving Helen and Clive a chance to rectify the situation. "But if payment isn't received in 30 days, I said firmly, "we'll act without delay." Oliver nodded, understanding my determination. Life went on. I was still attending book club and chess tournaments, hosting my grandchildren, socializing with new friends, but the shadow of possible legal problems overshadowed these joys. One evening, as I sat on the terrace watching the sunset, I was joined by Eleanor Pritchett. She often dropped in for a chat, and I appreciated her company, intelligent, unsentimental. "You seem troubled these days, Ezra," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "Is something wrong?" I told her briefly about the loan situation and Helen's call. "What are you going to do?" Eleanor asked when I'd finished. "Protect what's mine," I replied, "even if it means breaking up with my daughter for good." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "You know, Ezra, sometimes the hardest choice is between family and your own well-being. Most people choose family even if it means suffering, but it's not always the right choice." "Are you speaking from experience?" I asked. "Yes," she smiled sadly. "My brother was an alcoholic. For years I tried to save him. I gave him money, paid for treatment, put up with his breakdowns. It was ruining my life, my marriage, my health. Finally, I made a choice, of myself and my husband. I stopped communicating with my brother, stopped helping him financially. He died 2 years after that, and part of me still feels guilty. but the other part knows it was the only way I could keep myself together. I knew what she was talking about. Sometimes family ties become chains that pull you down, and the only way to survive is to break them. Your daughter made her choice when she decided to deceive you, Eleanor continued. Now it's your turn to make a choice, and no one has the right to judge you, whatever it may be. We sat in silence, watching the last rays of sunlight color the sky golden. At that moment, I realized that I had already made my choice. I had chosen myself, my new life, my peace. Chose freedom from a toxic relationship, even if it meant losing my daughter. Family bonds are valuable when they are based on love and respect. But when they become a tool of manipulation and a source of pain, their breakup brings not grief, but liberation. I was free, truly free for the first time in years. And that freedom was worth all the loss and disappointment.